Welcome, everyone, to the BSIG webinar series, episode number 4. I am your host, Seth Cordes of Uncommon Catalyst. I'm joined today by Rafat Zaini, a longtime Business SIG member, currently working on his PhD in Systems Dynamics at WPI. Our guest today is Tim Clancy. Tim received his undergraduate degree in Business and History from Reinhardt University, focusing on civil wars and revolutions. He received his Master's of Science in Simulation Science and Insurgency Dynamics from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. His master's thesis explored the mechanics that led to the rapid growth and staying power of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Tim is currently working on his PhD in Systems Dynamics at WPI with a focus on reduction of violence and instability, looking at anonymous online threats, mass shootings, riots, insurgencies, ethnic cleansing, terrorism, and emerging states. Originally trained in Lean in 1998, Tim has spent the last 18 years applying these techniques in non-manufacturing environments, focusing on private sector process improvement and enterprise transformation. Most recently, Tim served as chief methodologist for Smarter Process at IBM. Today, we'll be looking at the intersection between Lean performance improvement methods and systems thinking / systems dynamics. Point of order, if you joined today via the Google event or Google Plus event page, you should be able to post questions there in real time that we'll try to answer live on the air. If you're joining by the YouTube live stream, please note that there is a 2 to 3 minute delay, and we'll be monitoring YouTube comments, but we won't be able to hear your questions posed until the delay has passed. I'm sorry, I should clarify. We won't be able to hear your questions posed until the delay has passed. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim. And go ahead, Tim.
All right, thank you, Seth. Go ahead. Good morning, everyone. Wanted to thank Seth Cordes and Rafat for hosting this today. Also, my appreciation to Business SIG for inviting me for this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and screen share here and go ahead and get started with the presentation. So the topic today is the missing link in systems thinking with Lean. And Seth provided a little bit of my background on this. I know it actually sounded a lot more interesting when he was talking about my current work with insurgencies and terrorism and all that stuff, and now we're talking about Lean, but I'll try and make this as interesting as possible. And I promise that there is a provocative question for the Business SIG Society to answer at the end of this discussion. So a little housekeeping. Seth mentioned that I welcome questions throughout, so please type those into Rafat or Seth throughout the conversation. To be respectful of time, we're going to pause for a Q&A at about 15 till the hour. However, we have, Seth has told me we have plenty of time to do this, so we will not cut off if there are people still discussing at 1 o'clock. We'll continue on. I will also be posting these slides in the link when they are available on my LinkedIn, where I hope to continue the discussion on the provocative question I'll be asking. So hopefully this topic of the missing link here today is just an introduction to what may be a larger discussion with the Business SIG going forward. So with that, I'll go ahead and begin. So these are what we're going to cover today. Is just a little bit of my background in Lean and systems thinking, and then some of these other topics as we go forward. Hopefully everyone has a grounding in what Lean is. If you don't, in a very short summary section, Lean is a process improvement methodology that focuses on removing waste and improving value add to clients. It is in the same realm as you might have heard of Six Sigma or other process improvement methodologies. There's a lot of them out there. Lean is a specific one I've been working on for a very long time, and it's very near and dear to my heart. I used to joke, if you cut me, I bleed Lean. Now I'm not sure if you cut me, I bleed Lean or system dynamics. That's probably up for debate. So we'll go ahead and get started. My career began by accident. I really actually wanted to be a historian, and I thought I was horrible at math. This will be context important for the latter parts of this discussion. So in 1992, I actually was pursuing a history degree at the University of Montana, where I dropped out, flunked out in 1994 with a very low GPA and joined Vanstar Corporation in operations. So my introduction and the context I come to in Lean is having been a practitioner, not an academic. Beginning in 1994, in this context of working on-site at Microsoft and Vanstar, I was introduced to improvement methodologies common at the time, total quality management, ISO standards, rapid reengineering. In 1998, my first Lean training was delivered in Atlanta, Georgia by a company named Delta Point. They had just delivered training to Boeing. Lean was still pretty new in the US. It had been obviously rolled out to a few manufacturing companies. Boeing had been one of the first non-auto manufacturing companies to do it. and Delta had trained Boeing and come to us in Atlanta in 1998. And in 1998, this was the very first time I ever heard the term systems thinking as a concept within Lean. And this is where I want to ground this presentation today on this concept of systems thinking and this idea that there's been a missing link somewhere in Lean around this term. Basically, for the next 5 or 6 years, I was doing basic to intermediate Lean projects. I did go back to school at Reinhardt University in 2004 and got a BS in business and a B in history, just proving it's never too late to go back. I joined IBM in 2005, where I was a member of the Lean Six Sigma consulting team. I received my Master Black Belt certification in 2006. My work shifted over time to more advanced project work across many sectors: financial, healthcare, industry, chemical processes, but mainly focusing on knowledge environments, humans and information, where Lean has traditionally struggled a little bit, but that was sort of my sweet spot. However, in 2009, I began shifting more and more to what I call wicked mess problems. This was when I was working with the U.S. military, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, with large Fortune 50 companies. And then beginning in 2014, I became the chief methodologist of Smarter Process within IBM. This means I had a portfolio of Lean, Six Sigma, Agile, BPM, and sort of oversaw the consultants and practitioners within IBM delivering this and the consulting practices and techniques we had. I was responsible for making sure we were innovative and on the leading edge of that effort. In December 2015, I did leave IBM to focus full-time on system dynamics, both from a school standpoint and for consulting. So that's a little bit background. Again, the comments I have today is from a practitioner standpoint. You'll see nowhere in this timeline where I went to school to get great at Lean. My background in Lean is having done project work and learned from on-the-job experience. So if I overlook anything from an academic perspective, that may be where that arises from. So over this period of time, I really realized that problem complexity, when we're dealing with this problem of how do you improve performance of processes, increases on two scales. And I stole liberally from Roth and Senge, who articulated, and they stole from other people's works, that this increases on two scales: behavioral and dynamic complexity. And so to orient this graph, on the left-hand side is a axis that is, as you go from top to, or bottom to top, you increase behavioral complexity. This is the difference in people's values and assumptions. What they agree upon as terms. You might call this culture, but it can also be within a company. It would be, for example, the difference between sales and operations, or manufacturing and engineering, or tech support and software developers. People begin to see the world in different ways. They have different vocabulary of how they describe. They have different value sets. That's behavioral complexity. On the bottom going across is dynamic complexity. This is the relationships between cause and effect. And as you increase in dynamic complexity, the more steps and interactions, the more interdependencies, you begin to lose that relationship of what caused what effect. And when you have a large, complex organization, you have this high dynamic complexity. Where these two begin to interact is in this four-quadrant chart in the middle here. On the lower left are tame problems. They can be broken down and solved independently or in isolation by conventional methods. There's low behavioral complexity, low dynamic complexity. I give an example of this as classic accounting. Everyone agrees on the same terms. They all use the same vocabulary. It's relatively cut and dry. You add credits here, you subtract debits there. It sort of all flows out. Very simple, basic things like that. As you increase the behavioral complexity, though, you begin to get wicked problems. This is where things like diplomacy, cultural change, change management, because people are seeing things in different perspectives. It may not be a very dynamic, complex problem, but because people are bringing their own ideas and conceptions and have these distances between conceptions, it's really a challenge to get them to see things the same way. On the bottom part, tame problems become messes when you get into high dynamic complexity, when you have so many different pieces and moving parts going on that you can no longer solve the component in isolation. And this may sound familiar. You begin to have feedback loops. You have interactions between parts. You have that circumstance we find so often in system dynamics where you can't really replicate the same test because the conditions have changed in the real world. Well, when you combine these two together, you end up in the upper right quadrant, what's called wicked messes by Roth and Senge. And this is where you have high behavioral complexity and high dynamic complexity. You've got large, complex, interlinked systems of systems that span multiple cultures, cultures within cultures. They have divergent assumptions. They may have different even understandings of what the problem is. I often say in these areas, 48% of any problem is getting everyone to agree on what the same problem is, and 48% of the solution is getting them to all agree on the same solution. The classic wicked mess, which needs no further explanation, is sort of U.S. Congress, right? The different parties have different value statements on what the problems even are and whether they're even problems in their relation to each other. So this is the framework I began to realize as I moved through my career that problems can begin to be sorted in. And this slide shows, so if I were to map my projects over time, where they fell, and this is a notional and illustrative map, so it's not necessarily mathematically charted, but if I were to place each one of the projects that I had worked on as one of these little squares, I noticed it began to fall within these boundary limits. And as a practitioner, I probably did hundreds of projects in Lean and Six Sigma. As a chief methodologist, I've certainly seen many hundreds of certification projects as I help people work through their Lean or Black Belt or even Master Black Belt certifications. I've looked at studies looking at thousands of projects, and this behavior trend tends to hold consistent. The problems that these methodologies attempt to solve tend to kind of fall in this middle area here where they're sort of definitely clustered in the upper range of tame problems where there's something to dig into. It. You know, if it's super simple, we tend not to apply these methods because they are resource intensive. You have specialized skill sets. There's just not the return on effort or investment for the lower left. But as you get over to the right in the messes, they really begin to taper off because the dynamic complexity becomes so high. And as you get up in wicked problems, they really become so sparse because the tools for qualitative, emotive, cultural differences really begin to be challenged. And certainly as you move into this wicked mess area, it's just decided it's too hard. We don't do that kind of work. You'll hear a lot of times, don't try and boil the ocean, right? Don't try and fix it all. That's just too hard. In fact, if you were to go back and ask me in 2006, I developed a method for dealing with problems in that area, which was actually sequencing many projects to deal with the wicked mess. Rather than tackling in one project, you use sequencing. There's a chapter I have in a book on that about how you can sequence Kaizens. And so it was just considered you don't ever try wicked messes because it's just too hard. You kind of take a different approach. The problem with that, however, is our clients, whether we're internal clients, the CEOs, the COOs, our governmental leaders, or our external clients as consultants and practitioners and academics, their problems exist increasingly in those wicked mess spaces. That's where the really challenging problems that people need help with. A lot of the problems they can figure out on their own, and tame problems they can kind of muddle through. And what I noticed were sort of three areas in wicked messes I encountered a great deal of time in my career. One of which is, ironically, when you deploy Lean or Six Sigma or one of these performance improvements. So when you take a company that says, hey, this sounds like a good idea, I want to deploy it across 50,000 people or my global operations, the projects may only be good within those boundaries, but the process of deployment itself is a wicked mess. You're deploying across multiple internal cultures. They have different views of what project or process improvement is. I've worked in mutual insurance companies where the actuaries certainly had a different improvement of what statistical correctness was versus a software programmer. Anywhere you get into enterprise transformation, it may not even be in deploying a new method, but when you're trying to reinvent your business model or transform the enterprise because you're facing some sort of competition, these are wicked mess problems, and these are where we get turned to as experts to say, help me out in this. This is difficult. I need your help. In the upper right is HQDA, stands for Headquarters Department of the Army, and OSD stands for Office of the Secretary of Defense. These are two areas I had the privilege of working within, wherein every single thing you touched was a wicked mess. This is Headquarters of the Department of Army, for just orientation, is at the Pentagon, and it sort of oversees all Army operations. And the Office of the Secretary of Defense is a similar activity, but it's at the top of the DoD and organizes activities across the entire Department of Defense. So these kind of problems, all of a sudden now you're dealing with stakeholders in the Army are varied, as you have your soldiers, you have your families, you definitely have veterans groups, but you also have taxpayers concerned about how their dollars are being used. You have the public that is somewhat skeptical about what's going on in these processes. You have politicians that are asking questions. You have a wide stakeholder group of different cultures and beliefs. They're certainly dynamically complex. These are large, extremely large, complicated organizations. So up in this quadrant, even if you were using lean, the problems they would bring to you would automatically be in this wicked mess. And it really challenged me because even though I'd learned the term system thinking back in 1998, I'd been exposed to this term systems thinking, I was having a hard time figuring out what that meant. Systems thinking, this next section, is it's described but never explained. So when I went back and began reviewing the literature, when I began running these problems in the wicked mess area, well, this is the space that you would think systems thinking would help most. And certainly, system thinking is a required element wherever you go in lean. And ASQ stands for the American Society of Quality. They hold the keys for certifications. They hold the standards. When you look at their quality body of knowledge, which is an overarching sort of across-the-board certification standard, they call out, and I've sort of highlighted, that systems thinking is important to know. And that, by the way, is the only time systems thinking shows up in that entire body of knowledge. It's those two words right there. So it's a 20-page document of everything you need to know, and that's it. When you look at their ASQ Master Black Belt certification, which for them covers both Lean and Six Sigma, again, it shows up with this definition. So I've sort of highlighted it, is they're supposed to apply systems thinking, and to them this just means to anticipate the effect that components of a system can have on other subsystems and adjacent systems. You need to be able to analyze. This is, okay, that makes sense, but it doesn't really tell me how. And just to confirm that I wasn't going crazy over the course of 20 years, which can happen when you do this kind of work, I went back, and I have the benefit of having training programs that have been developed at IBM for clients, that we have received from clients, that I have seen from competitors as part of competitive review. I looked at about over 20 different training programs that involved Lean. All of them mention systems thinking. Not a single one explains how to do it. So this is odd, because anyone who's familiar with Lean, it's called a socio-technical methodology. It's filled with tools and techniques. And what socio-technical means is that there's techniques in it that deal both with social aspects, but also more technical. So they're trying to say there's leadership behaviors, but there's also tactical process-based things. And these are just a list of all the many tools and techniques that are in Lean. It's a very tool-robust environment. So here's just a list of them. However, over 20 years, when I talked about and read about and thought about systems thinking, there was not a single tool or technique associated with that term, systems thinking, let alone a suite of tools. So by way of comparison, when we talk about waste in Lean, there are 8 wastes. When we talk about the 5 S's, right, there's 5 A's. Lean has all these tools that come in suites or portfolios. But with systems thinking, that's what it is. It's the term. That's what you get. You're supposed to use systems thinking. And as to what that is, kind of work it out, and I hope it works out for you. This was the real question mark. Well, being good thinkers, we sort of filled in the blanks, right? We sort of retroactively engineered what we thought it was and sort of just said, well, we think systems thinking is this thing. And what we think that was an evolution that we understood it to come from that looks like this. We didn't think it was actually a problem there was no tool, because we actually assigned it to coming from Edward Deming, who talked about system thinking. And this map, this is actually an extract. So to orient this chart, a phylomimetic view looks at the evolution of ideas over time, and it comes from the root word of phylogenetic tree. A phylogenetic tree is just a branching diagram that shows the inferred evolutionary relationships between genes. A phylomimetic tree does the same thing for ideas. So this is part of a much larger project I did that I shared, that I was looking at the evolutions of continuous process improvement. So I traced back into the 1800s, all these different concepts and ideas. And what I've highlighted here is the key ideas that came together to Lean. And so you can see on the left a timeline that begins in about 1950 and goes up to about 1990. I sort of shrunk it. There's stuff at the bottom that I kind of cut off because and I wanted to keep the picture somewhat legible, and it goes up to current day. But you can see on the right these ID codes of where the ideas are, and they relate to the picture. And you can see that, you know, waste removal, automation, 5 Whys, Jidoka, these come out in the 20s and 24. Waste removal originally conceived by Henry Ford. The other ones come from Sakichi Toyoda, who is the one of the many Toyota founders or key instigators of what would become the Toyota production system that would become lean. You can see these other ones here through the 20s and 50s, and what you see here is all of these come together in 1968 in number 35. And I put this as red in a phylogenetic tree. A red is like when a lot of different methods come together in one publishable work we can refer to from that point on. And this is when Takeshi Ono publishes Toyota Production System Beyond Mass Production. It's a very well-known but somewhat hard to get book. And we always went back and thought, you see this green line here. When we went back and said, what does systems thinking mean? We go, okay, number 22, that's Deming. He talked about system thinking. Okay, we know Deming had a lot of influence on the Japanese, the supermarket concepts that they studied. He went over to Japan and practiced over there. So we would draw a little circle around Deming's concept of system thinking, show it comes up into Toyota Production System, and then that get incorporated up into 52, which is lean, which is when James Womack begins writing about it in the West in The Machine That Changed the World. So this just shows kind of a very specific way of how we view the evolution of this term. And I want to get back to this later because we're going to return to this view near the end when I propose my provocative hypothesis. So again, we didn't find it a problem that there were no tools because we thought systems thinking was something Deming was talking about. It's a good concept. You need to know about it, but there's not much in the way of tools. So now we talk about examples of system dynamics for lean. So lean suffers from not having this clear syntax and grammar for systems thinking. Six Sigma, for those who are familiar, is at times, loosely and badly sometimes, depending on the practitioner, but it's founded on statistical practices. But lean has no scientifically rigorous underpinning, and that's always been a challenge when trying to get clients or employees or other stakeholders to sort of buy into why these things work. And I sort of joke that much of lean teaching in the West is sort of a three-stage faith-based system. The first one is trust us, it worked for Toyota. You know, hey, Toyota's very successful, you want to be like Toyota. And in fact, that's the entire reason that lean came to the US is that James Womack got a grant from the government to study why Toyota was beating the socks off of American car manufacturers, and he published his work in the seminal book called The Machine That Changed the World in the late 80s, and then he did some subsequent publications, and everyone wanted to be like Toyota. So when everyone wanted to be like Toyota, how you be like Toyota? You embrace lean. The next stage is trust me, I've done this before, right? I've done this for 20 years. I've seen it work in a lot of places. It can work here. Just give it a shot. We'll walk you through it. And then finally, after they've been through it once or twice, we sort of say, trust yourself, see how it worked last time. But at no point can we really sufficiently explain why it's working. And the more time has passed, this lack of explanation really began bothering me because I'm here, I believe in it, I absolutely believe in it, but it's kind of faith-based. I'm not really able to really explain why these things are working, and this is gnawing at me in the back of my head throughout my 18 years doing lean, especially when I'm in front of CEOs and COOs and folks like that, and they're saying, well, how do you know it works? And I can say, well, I've seen it work. And so that was always something kind of lingering in the background as an itch that was waiting to be scratched. And then one sunny day in Kabul, I stumbled on system dynamics. So in the summer of 2012, I mentioned I worked for the Army and the Secretary of Defense. I actually was deployed in Afghanistan for 2 years doing work over there with the U.S. military. And it was my second year deployed. I had started out in doing efforts to defeat roadside bombs, and after we gained a large group, actually gained some success in that, I was retasked to work in Kabul on the retrograde, which is the U.S. military withdrawal of all the military personnel, all the material out of the theater by October 2014. It's a huge logistical challenge trying to get this out of Afghanistan, and they wanted to create a model in advance and identify where choke points would occur so that we could go out and use our process improvement skills to sort of streamline it. And as you might expect, this is very difficult to do in Excel, which is the tool I had to work with. So one sunny day, and the joke is, of course, in Kabul, they're all pretty sunny days. It's a very warm country for the most part, Afghanistan. I had created a model in Excel that used a lot of concepts that may be familiar. It had, in the one spreadsheet, it had every single day for the entire simulation run for the next views, each of which listed an index of probably 27 different parameters that would do lookup functions and pull it out. I basically recreated continuous integration in the spreadsheet, and then it would do all this whiz-bang stuff, and it would have all these formulas, and it would basically run a continuous integration model in Excel. No one understood how it worked. It was very difficult to explain. It was prone to breaking down, and I figured there had to be a better way. So I started really digging into other ways, and this is when I came across system dynamics. This is again, as a practitioner, not someone who has studied this academically, this is the first time, and I want to emphasize, in 16, probably by this point, 18 years of doing problem solving professionally and 16 years of lean, that I had ever heard of the term system dynamics. So I just want to maybe orient the group that may think of this as something that is widely known, is that if you're out in the business world and you don't necessarily have the academic background, system dynamics is not well known. But I did come across it, and it was like finding the answer to all my questions. Because, system dynamics, what it has, obviously, is for systems thinking, those tools we need to solve wicked messes. System dynamics obviously has a syntax and grammar. It has a very sophisticated syntax and grammar. It has stocks, it has flows, it has rules for how they're used. It has a qualitative set of techniques with causal loop diagramming. It has quantitative techniques in simulation model building. And I began studying online through the course. I was still in Kabul, so I was doing the online courses. I would download the videos from WPI. I would watch them when I was in my bunk or at the morale center, take the test. And I began applying. I actually came back. We finished our deployment there. I came back and was working stateside 2013, 2014, 2015. I began using system dynamics to fill that missing link, that gap that lean could never describe. I used system dynamics to begin filling that. And so I'm going to provide a few examples now, just a few, about how I began using that. So in lean, one of the hardest concepts to get across people is why pull is dramatically better than push. And this is a big leap. This is literally changing the entire business model of the organization on its head, because wherever you introduce pull, and by pull I mean instead of doing work and sending it to the next person in line, you wait for the work, you pull it when you're ready to do it. So the person at the end of the line is the one who determines the flow rather than the one upstream. And I often describe this to clients that you can start a pull-based system in one area, but it's like pulling on a string of thread or in a sweater. You're going to eventually unravel everything in a company, because our entire system, from budgeting to staffing to the way we run departments, is based off push. And if you switch to pull, eventually you're going to have to unravel everything. And this is very difficult for people to jump into. And it was hard for them to understand why it was better. So we would run this game, push versus pull, and actually the first time I saw this game was back in 1998. This game, push versus pull, sold me in 5 minutes. This game actually takes, I run it a lot of times. It takes, each round is about 5 minutes. I can teach people how to do it in 30 seconds. A round is about 5 minutes. You do one round in the push method, then you do one round in the pull method. It's dramatically different, and then you do a debrief. So it's very quick. And it was this game specifically that converted me to lean in 5 minutes, and yet it took me probably another 15 years, 16 years almost, to be able to articulate using this diagram why it worked. And that's when I'm talking about that missing link in lean, is that this is a causal loop diagram, and what it shows, right, is this, it's all orients around this production loop in the blue, where you've got a certain amount of work to complete, capacity. This generates a backlog. Your work to do comes in. There's time pressure. That creates errors. That creates rework. That overall increases the time per task. That makes, as your time per task goes up, or down, your work complete. And then the other loops, the green loop, is your push or pull loop. Depending on what your batch size or inventory is, or how you're managing your workflow, is whether you're pushing or pulling. If you only have one thing going on at a time and you will not take another thing until that one thing is done, your batch size is 1 and you're pulling. If instead you have a backlog of stuff on your desk and other people can throw stuff on your desk with no control, that's a push system. It's the one we're most familiar with. So depending on those variables, that would change whether this loop was, this green loop was in a push or pull orientation. And finally, that brown loop is, as the manager, part of the game is you walk around the manager and you ask people what's going on with an order, and they have to stop and kind of sort through all the papers and try and find information, which is an interruption. So it shows the challenge of responding to real-time inquiries. Well, when you run this game, it's very apparent to people that the pull system is not just a little better than push, it's dramatically better than push, 3 to 5 times better. But no one can really explain why. So it's more experiential. We tell them, hey, you lived it, you felt it, now let us do it in your company, by the way. We just took you from a 5-minute game with little pieces of paper. Do you mind if we deploy this on your billion-dollar system? They tend to get a little hesitant around that, and we often fail to go to this very powerful lean tool. Well, you can see here pretty quickly that this is a very simple causal loop diagram that if you follow it around, it's a virtuous or vicious cycle. Should be very familiar to system dynamicists that explains, hey, if you change that batch size in inventory and you decrease the batch size to manage inventory in that green loop, you're going to decrease the effort to manage workflow, which is going to decrease time per task, which will increase the work complete. You know, all of a sudden you've switched a vicious loop to virtuous. By introducing syntax and grammar of feedback, vicious to virtuous, this type of tool, I've all of a sudden created an ability to explain systems thinking and why this works in lean in a much more powerful way than I ever had in the 16 years where this was my full-time job to explain this. So this is just demonstrating a very simple, easy way that system dynamics presented a tremendous benefit over what we were doing in the past. And I tell you, I wish I had this diagram for probably 95% of the engagements I did, because I might have gotten them to do poll earlier. When I did get them to do poll, it was literally a leap of faith. And it was because senior leaders trusted in me, wanted to be like Toyota, or themselves were willing to take that leap. There was no sort of grounding that we could give them to build that confidence. But this was not where system dynamics was limited, obviously. We can go to a much more sophisticated method, which is in simulations. So I talked in wicked messes often is deployments often run afoul. And there's one of these debates that goes on amongst master black belts, which are the top level experts in Lean Six Sigma, about the best way to deploy these methods at large companies. And this debate has gone on since I've been involved, which is this, the concept is you generally only want to apply these techniques to processes, things that continually go on and have a flow. You never want to apply them to projects that may start and end, because if you do, there's no long-term benefit or gain. And this is actually a very deep debate that's gone on for years and has adherents on both sides. And so the problem statement I use with the simulation is, could continuous process improvement projects be used to improve performance of projects themselves after the project has already started, right? Even if any gains aren't able to replicate on a process or subsequent work, under what conditions could you kind of use a Lean or Six Sigma technique to justify the temporary disruption of the project? Now, at the time I did this, and this is very late, this is 2013, 2014, so most of my career is in my rearview mirror at this point, but the experts are split between two schools of thought, right? They were generally represented, though not perfectly, and you'll see this time and time again. Those who primarily are adherents of Lean believe Lean should be applied in a lot of areas. You shouldn't limit it necessarily. Those who come from more of a Six Sigma background may believe you should only do it on processes. And so this is kind of where it broke down, and there's always a lot of debate. It's kind of like it almost becomes a religious debate because these are faith-based discussions. Well, system dynamics now allows us to develop a very sophisticated operational simulation where we can test this. So that's what I did. So hopefully everyone's familiar with the projects model. It's a very famous Six Sigma model, or Six Sigma, a system dynamics model. And what I did is I simply, it's the one with the rework loop and the time pressure and the scheduling pressure and all that. What I did is I simply added 2 pieces of structure to it. I added a CPI structure, which replicated the impact of starting a project within a project itself. So this was structure I added that would replicate starting a CPI project within a project. And it could simulate a Lean Kaizen project, a Six Sigma project. it would simulate the disruptions a project would cause, because obviously if you stop, if you're doing a project that's in flight, say a software development project, you're going to disrupt what's going on to try and improve the effort. So this structure is kind of an overview. It had increased staff costs, reduced productivity. I was trying to capture all the aspects that could come into play here that were part of these debates and questions. And again, this is just the structure I added to the overall project dynamics model, which is, I think it's SD562, and there's other versions of it out there, have the full model. And then I also added a benefit structure that when the CPI project is finished, when the time duration of doing it is finished, you get a certain benefit reduction. And the lean projects would get a certain benefit that I based off of an analysis of what had gone through the lean projects I had in my portfolio. And then the Six Sigma project would return certain benefits. Again, this is simply a way now to simulate this debate, and rather than play it out in our unfortunate hapless clients, be able to sort of simulate it in the simulation space and see what happens. So the insights we had for testing, we ran this actually within IBM because this was a debate that was constantly plaguing all our clients. Our clients came to us and said, do this, and then we get in a big fight. This is actually a sweet spot early in the simulation for single-phase models. It's an emergent model. It's not surprising, but only with certain aspects, right? And other parameters, so these were the maximum effective customer uncertainty, maximum rework discovery time, error on error fraction. Other parameters are only in play after the latter half of the model. So other things like scheduling pressure, you can't even improve those because they haven't emerged until the latter half of the model when you begin missing those deadlines, like hiring delay, time to gain experience. You can't improve hiring delay on a project that hasn't hired anyone yet. So even though those ones can generate benefits, by the time they come into play, the project is already so far gone, it's probably the cost of doing it. And then there are a few parameters that are just overwhelmed by the multiplicative formulations, error fraction. There can be benefits. The relative benefit is not sufficient to overcome. So then what I did is I showed my practitioners these charts, and it blew them away that I could now quantify with the assumptions and the boundaries. And this looks at, this is throughput productivity. So this is increasing the ability to do increased throughput, and you could simulate whether you got a 10% benefit or 20% benefit or 30% benefit across project cost, total work done, the staff level, the done right first time. Gray was the baseline, and blue was the, so you can pretty easily visually see you can get a really dramatic benefit. Even if the project, it's just a project, the benefit, even with all those costs and other factors worked in, it's worth it. And so the ability to create these simulations all of a sudden resolved this argument overnight. When I presented these charts, and this is another one, reduction in waste, another lean classic. By the way, lean actually had uncovered some things the project dynamics totally missed, which in the project dynamics, it assumes all work to do is valid. Very bad assumption. Lean assumes that a lot of work you do is actually waste, so it looks at removing waste. Generally, one of the things that's interesting to note is if you run a reduction in waste off work to do, you get probably the best benefit because that eliminates the work to be done in total, which cuts off all those feedback loops. And again, shows that we have a lot we can learn from lean, even as system dynamicists, just as system dynamics can teach lean. So this was another lean one that showed, and again, it's just a very visual way of demonstrating the point. And here are some Six Sigma ones. Now these showed a lesser benefit, even though there was a benefit. You could see that the benefit of Six Sigma was less than lean, and this is probably due to the nature and the reduced incremental benefit you often get. But the summary conclusions is it does have a valuable role in improving projects already started. So we had a client that does software projects, and we used this to actually change the way we deploy Lean Six Sigma. Before this, we would never use an improvement method on a project in flight, but in software, that's all they had. All of a sudden, we started doing this. We saved them millions of dollars and shaved literally months. We'd have a project that was 18 months. It may have been 4 months underway. We'd go in and do a 3 or 4 month lean Kaizen, and we'd bring it in from 18 months to 12 months. But it's not a black or white. It's not it either does work or it doesn't. There are certain types of improvements where it works better or worse. There are certain parameters of timing. All those things we learn from system dynamics, you can learn through these simulations of what's the right timing window, what's the right techniques to use. And then a lot of areas are not better or worse, right? So, and if it's not clearly better or worse, it's given these efforts are somewhat disruptive, you probably shouldn't do it. So we revamped our entire approach of delivering continuous process improvement efforts to standalone projects based off this simulation. And there was no way that this could have been done without a simulation science effort, a system dynamics effort. There was just no way of simulating these projects, taking all those variables, running those simulations. All we had was the collective experience of everyone in the room who had quote unquote tried it here or tried it there, and then sort of the anecdotal heuristic guidelines that arose from that. So very, very powerful use of system dynamics to begin to approach the systems thinking dilemma. So I'm coming up to where we will probably hopefully break for some questions, and it leads back to where we started. What is this missing link to why Lean doesn't describe its systems thinking? It just kind of leaves it hanging here. And what is my provocative question, which I hope will generate at least some discussion in the business SIG? Well, let's review the evidence so far. The concept of systems thinking is historically rooted, right? It's found nowhere in the original Japanese writings of Ono explicitly. There's nowhere that you go in Takashi Ono and they say, here is systems thinking, this is how you do it. But obviously, with waste removal, they're activating powerful feedback loops. They implicitly understood what it meant to think within a system. And we know from Deming that this was something that he taught, they understood it, but it's not explicitly referred to. So, but then even though systems thinking is routinely mentioned in the certification in the modern literature, there are no tools or techniques to support how it is done. This third bullet here, the term first appears in the English literature beginning in the late 1980s to early 1990s. The final pieces of evidence here. These writings in the late 1980s and early 1990s were largely centered around a group of writers who, A, worked and studied in the 1980s at MIT. This is Womack, Senge, and Roos. B, they had backgrounds in industrial policy and systems engineering at MIT. Womack had a PhD of industrial policy from MIT. Senge had his master's in social systems modeling at MIT and a PhD in management. And C, at least several of these, which you should see where this is going right now, had intersected with and worked alongside Jay Forrester. Obviously, Senge co-wrote articles, studied extensively with Forrester, and had a lot of intersection. So what's my controversial hypothesis? The missing link of systems thinking is us. Systems dynamics is the missing link. I checked this when I was putting together this presentation. I was graduating high school when this was going on, but I checked with primary sources who worked with both the US and Japanese Lean thought leaders in the early 1990s. And I said, is this even plausible? And they actually came back and said, you know what? They recalled that the term systems thinking was one only mainly heard from Senge when he was writing about Lean, and they never heard it from the Japanese senseis. And systems thinking as a term of art, it appears, so what it appears looking at this, it was applied to a Toyota production system as it became Lean. So as the Toyota production system from Japan was studied by US writers and thinkers from the MIT culture, steeped in the MIT culture of the 1980s, looked at that Japanese system, they said, hey, this involves systems thinking, right? It makes sense to us. We're all very familiar with system dynamics. But this explains why there's almost no tools and techniques for it in an otherwise technique-rich methodology. Lean, when it's got tools and techniques for everything, it has exactly I think these system dynamics is created at MIT and Jay Forrester. And then in the 1990s, systems thinking, as part of the MIT culture and experience of Senge et al., gets applied as Toyota production system comes over and becomes Lean. So what I'm proposing is that it was never explicitly called out in the Japanese because that is something we applied to it when it came over and was translated because of that culture at MIT where this initial writing was done. So what are the implications of this hypothesis? Well, soon after system dynamicists applied the term systems thinking to Lean, I think a split emerged. Lean methods continued down a track to be trained to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of managers and workers worldwide. Ever heard the term Agile? Agile is lean thinking applied to software. A lot of times now when I go into companies, they're like, how does lean work with Agile? And I spend a lot of time showing that lean and Agile are two sides of the same coin. If you apply lean thinking to IT, you get Agile. If you distill why Agile works, you get lean theories. But neither lean nor Agile provides the systems thinking syntax, grammar, or tool set. On the other side of the split, system dynamics continued its shift to a non-business focus. This was in academics, government, sustainability, climate. You know, I'm not saying doesn't have a business focus. I'm obviously talking to the business SIG. But I think from where Forrester started with saying system dynamics is intended for business with the industrial model and his initial writings, it certainly shifted more so in the last 20 years to being less business focused and more non-business focused. But it continued to develop that syntax, grammar, and tool set that supports systems thinking. So you have this split emerge. Lean is an entirely a business-oriented venture, and it's only crossed over to government-type activities where they say, hey, we want to learn from what the best is in industry. Let's try a lean over in the government areas and see what it can do for us. System dynamics, I'm proposing, is not entirely non-business, but it's certainly shifted a little bit more away from business. I think folks like Kim Warren has done a great job in trying to bring it back more into the business focus, and I love these conversations with the business SIG and getting what the business SIG is doing, trying to get the system dynamics back into business. And at the bottom here is my provocative question. What can the business SIG or the society do to bridge this missing link of systems thinking between lean and system dynamics? We caused this, I think, in some ways, by inserting the term systems thinking into lean and then kind of going our separate ways. So this is where I conclude, but I want to continue the dialogue. I'm now going to open it up for questions, but I'm also going to post this presentation when it's done on LinkedIn along with the slides, and that post will begin with where this presentation ends, which is what the question is: what can the business SIG of the society do to bridge the missing link of systems thinking between lean and system dynamics? Now, my LinkedIn is probably 90% lean people, so it's going to be interesting to hear their response to this presentation when I post it. The folks I reached out to were very, very interested in this, and they actually thought it had a lot of merit to it, the discussion, people who have had a lot more experience than me. So it'll be interesting to see what they have, but I've included my LinkedIn URL down there if you want to join the discussion and continue the dialogue on what can be done to bridge this missing link. And with that, I'll pause now and turn it over to questions.
All right. Thank you very much. If you want to switch over to your video, we'll see your face there. So I think you raise a very interesting question. I had not been familiarized with lean. I am ignorant in the methods, so I'm very interested to see that there's a strong body of recommended tools and techniques, but not so much the explanation of why. And so my question to you, I guess, the first question is how much of that question, how among practitioners of lean, how common is that question of we know it works, just trust us, but I can't explain why?
It's very common when you talk to them in coffee shops and at the bar, when you talk to people who have 10 to 15 years experience in deploying it. When you're living lean, it's a very emotive experiential, so you're living it, you're doing it, and it makes sense practically. It's also a very pragmatic. A lot of the tools make sense in lean. So why do you remove waste? Because waste is inefficient, and a lot of the things that people hate in business, you can link them back to wasteful things. So it's not very controversial at that level. But when you begin looking at these much more complicated problems and things like system thinking, when you're trying to train managers or business leaders into systems thinking, this is where it comes up, and this is where this lack, I think, gets exposed. So it's really only in people who have been doing it for 12, 15, 20 years and had to have those conversations, training leaders, that this becomes really a sore point, that there's not more tools that they could use to train people. Now, I think some of these tools would really be useful at even the lower levels of practitioners. By the time I left IBM, we were using simple 1 and 2 loop causal loop diagrams with very inexperienced folks just to explain some of the feedback effects, which they got very quickly. I mean, they understood feedback in an unsophisticated, informal way, but they understood it very quickly, and it helped show why it was happening.
Very cool. Very cool. So hopefully this conversation here, I hope, is one of those things that we can do, obviously, to get that message out, and to show that there is that missing link. I think you've sold me on that. I'm going to open it up for questions again. Please do submit them. Rafat is watching the Google the Google Plus page. Those show up on our screen right away. Any comments that are posted on YouTube, we don't see those for, or there'll be a delay between when we can answer them and when you'll hear the response. But we do have one comment from a viewer. Says, in my humble opinion, the total education system is not oriented towards seeing the whole. Do you have thoughts on that, Tim?
Definitely, and that's the problem. I think what's happened with Lean is in a lot of cases you have these projects that are sort of like if you had a tablecloth and you poked a fork at it in different spots, you'd kind of get holes in different spots, but you're not really addressing the hole in the interconnection. Even the ability to display the hole in an interconnected way, the Army was constantly asking us, how do I see what's going on? How do I depict this complicated system, which is where a system dynamics view of a system, I think, is really what they're looking for. Now, they've used a system of systems engineering, SOSI approach, but I think, and you're starting to see some system dynamics in there, and I'm not saying they don't use it, but in an overall context, I think system dynamics is something that would help them link all these very, very different concepts, and even in a large corporation would help make it visible as to what the whole system is. And that is, I think, very important, whether you're talking about a Fortune 50 company or a mid-sized firm or any firm, really.
Okay.
I do have a question to you,
Yeah,
Tim. You demonstrated nicely the gap between the two aisles. Let's say the you can say the lean and systems thinking / system dynamics. What would you see as a practical step to bridge that gap?
I think at the very least, adopting or proposing that the syntax and grammar of system dynamics, so the way we talk about systems, becomes the syntax and grammar of systems thinking in Lean. And by that I mean concepts like feedback, concepts like stocks and flow, rates of change, things that we use as terms should be adopted within Lean as the terms of describing a system, even to give a common vocabulary. Whether they can create a causal loop diagram or a simulation or not is, I think, a little bit of a stretch in general. But there's not even a vocabulary for describing the elements of a system in Lean in that way. So the first step would be recommending simply to use the vocabulary and syntax and grammar we've developed. The other would be for practitioners who need to have these skills to start introducing at the ASQ level, perhaps, or in some body of knowledge, that the tools of systems thinking are things like causal loop diagrams, simple simulations. These need not be necessarily at the low level practitioner. I would say you're probably looking at black belt or above, or the equivalent in Lean, a sensei or something like that. But you should have at least an understanding of what these tools are and how to use them, especially if you're deploying Lean or working at a deployment function. So if you're managing Lean, if you or FOT were in charge of Lean for a company, you should know these things, because at least at that level, you're going to be managing projects that are going to have interactions with one another, and that's where that systems viewpoint is essential.
Thank you.
Okay.
What I'd like to see is more literature, I guess, in the Lean arena with the Lean magazines and the Lean journals written by system dynamicists that can explain Lean effects using concrete, scientifically based approaches of system dynamics and simulation science to demonstrate why do Kanbans work the way they do, why is waste removal so useful. These are things which are generally, I mean, they have more of a statistical flair, but they don't generally capture the feedback effects, which is why the literature never captures why Lean has such a powerful exponential benefit over some of these other methods. And I think that's an area where system dynamicists can directly apply, of taking these Lean techniques and explaining them using system dynamics or causal loop diagrams.
Yeah. So are there bodies of work where other systems dynamicists have done this, or could we, like, from the molecules effort and whatnot, define some of these core constructs and provide these demo models kind of in an environment that's easy for people to take and digest.
I think one of my concerns when I was looking at the project dynamics model, the fact that every time I see that displayed, I don't see waste removal as a concept of work to be done tells me that at least in generally there's not a lot of consideration of lean in system dynamics models. We tend to go with what we know, right? So in the project dynamic world, we call it the rework loop. Well, rework is only one of 8 kinds of waste. So in some ways, system dynamics can learn a lot from lean and model what those other 7 wastes are, which is all sorts of wastes that are not represented or captured in the project dynamics model and could probably capture it in a simple way. But and lean also has wastes of leadership and variation and things like that that would be great to capture, but I don't think are explicitly captured. So I think there's a mix there of where we can learn from each side.
Yeah, yeah. But as an interesting way, that's something that the business SIG could potentially put together a product or sponsor a product that that is a compendium of those in kind of a primer of sorts that looks at some of those, but we'd need the basis from someone with deep lean expertise, obviously. We tend to look at
that's easy to provide. I can provide lean. There's tons of lean resources out there that explain the concrete things of lean are. I think from that you can either derive the system effects or with a little interaction, it wouldn't be hard to divulge it. The lean effects from a system dynamic standpoint are not exceptionally complicated, but they are very useful to put out because they are often moving throughout a system, so they're not immediately apparent to the practitioner.
Right. So then ultimately what you end up with is a tool set, or at least some concrete evidence, like you've suggested, that lean practitioners could then use to explain to their clients and hope bring the two sides somewhat closer together in terms of effective mission.
I would propose there's a toolbox of, say, the most common 10 lean tools out there, waste, 8 waste, 5S, 5A, those things. You could make accompanying CLDs with short explanations of what those are, and you would then have a bridge that would implicitly give you systems thinking of why these tools work with a causal loop diagram that kind of provides a logical grounding that can explain not just trust us it works or it works, but can provide the logical reasoning as well. Simulations could be made, but that's sort of down the road and much more specific. But I think even a causal loop description of why these tools work would be useful.
Right. Excellent. Excellent.
Well, the question that you posted about the role for the business SIG to bring the applications of system dynamics to the business, that's the basically the basis for the business SIG of all that explains all the initiatives we have at the business SIG. And I think the success stories page we have is mainly an attempt to go find all successful business applications of system dynamics and put them under one roof. And if lean and system dynamics is an area to explore, that could be added to that list of successful, at least as a startup for that initiative to find out what's out there that could probably exist, but we don't know about until now. That's a suggestion, and we do have the venue to host this now.
I have seen at the conferences, I have seen several presentations on Agile explained with system dynamics, and the form and nature of what I'm proposing need not be that rigorous, but it's of the same nature. So I have seen efforts where people describe why Agile works and how you modify the parameters using system dynamics, and Agile itself is a sort of descendant of lean operating on many of the same concepts. So I think that would be at least an exemplar of what it might look like.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and we have no further questions. Rafat, you don't see anything else coming up on the YouTube comments yet, do you?
No, I don't.
All right. Well, I want to take the time then to close our conversation out. Thank you, Tim. I really do appreciate you taking the time. This has been very enlightening to me. I had no idea that there was this synergy, this potential synergy between the two methodologies. If you joined late, today's episode is available now on the Business SIG YouTube channel. Thank you to Rafat again for helping manage the question and answer process today and for arranging our guests. If you're interested in sharing your work or know of someone who may want to present please do let us know. We're booking a couple months into the future. Stay tuned. The Google group will announce our next webinar soon. In BSIG news, the annual meeting was held at the Systems Dynamics conference in July in Delft. We reviewed progress on initiatives and discussed our plans for the future. The video and the presentation are available on our website, sigs.systemsdynamics.org/business. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next month.